This lecture will cover Chapter 4, Shape and Space, and it's meant to accompany the reading. I would make sure you've done the reading first and then listen to the lecture for supplemental materials. In this chapter, we are dealing with both the ideas of shape and space. To start, shape is a two-dimensional area that's measured in height and width. So for the example here, it would be the square. When we talk about mass or form, we're talking about something that is a solid object, that it's three-dimensional and it has volume, meaning it can be measured in terms of height, width, depth, density, and weight. So for this example, the square is the shape, a cube becomes the form. Now, when we talk about forms in two-dimensional work, such as paintings and that, usually the three-dimensionality is implied in it. So like a painting, we have what's implied three-dimensional form of the cube, but it's still a flat surface. We see this in works such as with shape. This is Ellsworth Kelly's 3 panels, orange, dark gray, green, 1986 oil on canvas. It measures roughly 9 feet 8 inches by 34 feet and 4.5 inches. And what happens with this is it's composed of these 3 different shapes. Now what's interesting is the shapes themselves are attached to the wall. And this is what's known as figure-ground relation. And this is where the surface that a work is made upon actually becomes part of the work. So when we look at the objects themselves, the 3 forms are what are called the colored figures. These are what are called the positive shapes. However, note the implied lines between the figures themselves that create shape. So if we go like from the top of the orange triangle to the corner of the dark gray, and then same at the bottom, we create another space there, another shape there from these implied lines. These are what are known as negative shapes. So the color figures that demand our attention are the positive shapes, and then the implied lines create the negative space. Negative space is defined as empty spaces that acquire a sense of volume and form by means of the outline or frame that surrounds them. And we see this very interesting enough in this example here. Take a minute and look at this. What do you see first? Many of you will probably see a black vase in the middle, or you may see the 2 white faces facing each other. This is what's called a Rubin vase. With this, it plays with that idea, which is the negative shape, which is the positive. If you saw the vase first, that's the positive, and the white becomes the negative. However, if you saw the white first, the faces, the white's the positive, and the black is the negative. In sculpture, we see it in the empty spaces that are seen here. This is Barbara Hepworth's 2 figures, 1947 to 48, Elmwood and white paint. And you can see the negative space here is literally where she has cut away. Usually in sculpture, this is done very intentionally. Here, it almost seems to suggest, the holes almost seem to suggest a body of form itself. When we talk about space and architecture, think of it. What is architecture? It's some sort of wall that shapes something, right? A building surrounds an empty space in such a way as to frame it or outline it. Walls shape the space they contain, and rooms acquire a sense of volume and form. Now, sometimes this is meant to be very grand, such as in the Gothic cathedral that you see here. The Gothic cathedrals were meant to elicit a sense of awe due to their own sheer size and magnitude. It was the sense of grandeur. Light can also attribute significantly to our sense of space. Take a moment and look at these 3 different images of rooms here, and look at them and think about which one do you think is the largest room? Well, in the end, they're actually all 3 the same size. Yet, it's through the color and the light that usually makes the rooms look bigger. So the white room, white is a larger photograph, but the white room on the left, most people tend to believe that is bigger, and then the black room in the bottom right is smaller. Why? The lighter, the brighter we have it, usually it gives this sense of being bigger. Think about every home improvement show you ever watch, right? What do they always want to do? They want to knock down the walls. Why? It makes a space seem bigger and more open. All right, so when we are talking about works, sometimes we represent 3-dimensional space in 2-dimensional forms, such as we're looking here. This is a photograph by Ansel Adams. First, we're going to talk about perspective. Perspective is how we see a work. Here, what we're attempting to do is we're attempting to make a flat two-dimensional space seem three-dimensional. This has been known since the time of the ancient Greeks, but it wasn't really stressed in works until the Renaissance. And it can help create the illusion of deep space in a two-dimensional flat work. So first we'll talk about linear perspective. What we're seeing here is one-point linear perspective. Here, this is where lines are drawn on the picture plane in such a way as to represent parallel lines receding to a single point on the viewer's horizon. This point where they recede to is called the vanishing point. Think about railroad tracks, or in the image here, again, this is Ansel Adams' Manzanar, 1943. Here we can see this linear perspective in the street down the middle. It's wider when it's closer to us, and then we see as it gets further away, the lines get closer and closer to each other. This is one-point frontal linear perspective. It helps us to understand that there is depth within the work itself. Also, we notice in this what's called vantage point. Vantage point is where the viewer is positioned, meaning where are we looking at this from? So if the vantage point is directly across from the viewer, this is called frontal. If it's to the side, it's diagonal, which we'll see in a moment. What's also very interesting about this, the vantage point becomes very, very important in this photograph. Why? This was taken in 1943 during World War II, and it's actually of the internment camp Manzanar, where Japanese Americans, many of them American citizens, were held for over 3 years because there was the idea that they were going to be more loyal to Japan than to the United States. And because of this, they were put into these camps. Well, Ansel Adams was actually asked by the director of the camp, Merrick, to come in and take photographs of the camp so people could see they weren't so bad. Well, what happened was there were things he was not allowed to take pictures of. Things such as any guards, guns, anything, the fences, anything like that, he wasn't allowed to take the pictures from. So when you look at this, think about the vantage point that it is taken from. We can clearly see we're in some sort of elevated position. He's looking down on the camp. But as you look around, are there any, mountains, buildings, trees he could be up in? No. What he's actually doing in this, he's taking the photograph from the guard tower itself. So without ever having the guard tower in the image, he's letting the viewer know that it is there. All right, and then I mentioned again, this is the frontal one-point linear perspective. What we see here, if the vanishing point is to one side or the other, such as it is here, this is called diagonal. So this is a diagonal one-point linear perspective. Moving on to this work, this is by Duccio. This is the Annunciation of the Death of the Virgin, 1308 to 11, and this is a tempera on panel. And you can see this. Please make sure you look at this in your book. I actually just copied or screenshot the image, but here it's showing you some of the attempts of using perspective in the works. Now, this was an earlier work that first attempted to use perspective. Like I said earlier, really wasn't until the Renaissance that the Western world was concerned about showing correct perspective in the work. Here you can see a couple of the examples where it's working correctly. Right, we can tell the building, the room itself goes further back. But when you look at things such as the bench she's sitting on, the perspective doesn't really work. If we were actually to sit on that, it'd be sloped down and she'd fall off. Also, look at the stand that's holding the book. If that was actually in real life how this is, the perspective doesn't work, right? The book would actually fall off to the floor. So here we see some attempts of perspective and dimensionality, but Duccio doesn't quite get it right. Later in the Renaissance, we see this much improved. This is Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, circa 1495 to 98, and it is an oil and tempera on plaster, and this is in Milan. Now, this is a very good example of fully frontal one-point perspective. We can see here the walls of the building help create that linear perspective, which leads to the main focal point, which is Jesus sitting in the center. Interestingly enough, when they actually went to restore this painting, they found a small nail hole right above Jesus's head, and they believe Da Vinci actually took string and had made lines go out so he had the perspective perfectly right. Now here is an example of two-point linear perspective, meaning there are two different vanishing points. This is Gustave Caillebont's Place des Europe on a Rainy Day, 1876-77. It's an oil on canvas. So here when we look in the background, we see the building. You see you have a vanishing point to the left and a vanishing point to the right. Usually when we have multiple vanishing points, it makes a work more dynamic. This work is also very organized, and it's given a sense of order because it seems to be divided in 4 equal rectangles. You have the lamppost at the vertical line in the center, and then the horizon line, and it gives this a sense of order within the work itself. And then here I've just included a chart to help you see it very simply. All right, next we're going to talk about atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective, is the idea that it's how we as humans see the world. That objects that are closer to us in the foreground are usually bigger and in clearer detail, and those that are in the background are further away, smaller, and less detail, and usually are like a hazy gray or blue. Think about it when you're driving, right, and you're up on a hill and you see in the distance, it gets hazy in this light blue. So as we're looking at this photograph here, the tree in the very front perspective is closest to us, and we understand the city in the background is further away. Why? It's smaller and it's out of focus. Also, we have different ideas of distorting space. Usually we have a monocular, which means one-eyed point of view. So in this image, right, we're seeing one point of view. Yet look at this image by M.C. Escher. He likes to create these optical illusions. And what we have here is we have works from multiple points of view, like follow the stairs. So we can't be just looking at one viewpoint. We're looking at different people's perspectives, and he's put it all together here. Also, there's a term called foreshortening. Foreshortening means the dimensions closer to the viewer in the foreground are adjusted in order to make up for the distortion created by one point of view. And we see this clearly in the work here. This is Andre Magenta's The Dead Christ, circa 1480, and it's a tempera on canvas. So think about this. Where are we standing? We're standing at the end of the bed looking down at the figure. But what do you notice? Christ's legs are really, really short. True perspective would show the feet and the legs much bigger than the chest and the face. Compare it to this photo, right? This is if we were standing, we'd see it more like this than like this. So why did he do it this way? Well, he did it this way so that the focus would be on not the feet and the legs, but the chest and the face. That's where he wanted the focus on. So he intentionally uses this foreshortening to distort our viewpoint. All right, and then we also have ideas of what's called shifting perspective. And shifting perspective is seen in the work here. This is Chuzhan's Buddhist Monastery by Stream and Mountains, circa 960 to 85 CE. And it is ink on silk. And what you see here is the objects, the items in the foreground and background are about the same size and the same detail. And what happens with this is the idea is you're supposed to start in the foreground and then your eyes go through to the background, meaning the objects in the background and the foreground are equally important. And this is where we literally shift our perspective from one area to the next. Also, we have the flattening of space for creative reasons. This became popular in the late 19th and early 20th century with European painters, especially the post-impressionists. And we see it also in many modern works to help create distortion. So when you look at this photograph by Paul Strand, you focus on the geometric shapes. Well, what are you really looking at here? He's composed it in such a way that it flattens out. We're actually looking at somebody's front porch. It's the light coming through, the sun coming through the front porch rails, creating the shadows on the floor, and then the table. So it breaks it down to almost these geometric forms. We see it again in this photograph here. This is Geometric Backgrounds, New York, 1917. So when you look at this, again, at first we just see these geometric shapes. Well, what are we really looking at? Our vantage point is above, and we are looking down into somebody's backyards. And we can see the fences and the clotheslines help create this geometric shape. We also see this flattening in the work by Henri Matisse. This is Harmony in Red, or The Red Room, 1908-1909. It's an oil on canvas. Here he's flattened the form so much that the table itself almost seems to be, like the table and wall almost seems to be in one thing. We can't clearly tell, especially over in the middle, where the table ends and the wall begins. And with this, even the object on the left, some people argue that it's a window and we're looking outside. Others argue and claim that maybe it's a painting. But you clearly see this flattening, this distortion of space. And with work such as this, the idea is to focus on the creative idea, not the representational value of the work. We see this again in Paul Cézanne's Madame Cézanne in a Red Armchair, circa 1877, also in oil on canvas. Take a minute and look at this. You're also going to see the flattening, right? Look at the armchair itself. The part on the right seems to be, okay, we see depth there. She's got her arm resting on it. I'm sorry, on the left. But then on the right, it's much flatter, right? It doesn't seem like it's actual object there. And then also look at Madame Cézanne herself. Look at the dress. The lines on the dress like that. We don't see any sort of depth. If she was sitting there, right, we would see her lap. There's no lap here. It just seems to be one flat figure. So we have this intentional lack of spatial depth within the work. All right, then finally the chapter concludes by looking at a new space, which is the digital space. And this is a new media that explores digital space and digital tools. Think about that. When we're talking about the digital world, we're talking about a world that exists online, right? In our computers and other material. We need some other form to view it. Okay. Example of this is a beginning work of digital space. This is Terry Winter's Color and Information, 1998. And it's oil and acrylic resin on a canvas. And what happens with this, it combines traditional painting and forms. However, this was created by a computer. So the idea with this, it's this transitioning into digital media, and it's a combination of both order and chaos. And then the chapter concludes with talking about Feng Mengbo's The Long March Restart 2008. This was a video game installation. It's of 2 screens, approximately 20 feet by 80 feet. And it was created as if it was stills from a video game. Originally, there were 42 paintings titled Game Over Long March. Then it was all put together. Once Feng Mengbo got a computer, he transformed them into an actual video game. So the viewers follow the avatar as it makes its way through a series of events based on Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Red Party, 1934 to 35. And so here, with this giant digital space of 2 walls and 80 feet long, right, the viewer becomes immersed in this digital world. And in fact, there's actually 14 different levels of play. So you go inside and play the work, and you actually become an active part of the work itself. And I've attached here, you'll have to look at the slides that accompany this video, but there's a clip of a YouTube video, and this is just somebody going in and actually experiencing the exhibit, so you can see that. All right, and then the last image I have here is I want you to look at this. This is where the Rubens piece here, the disembarkment of Marie de Medici at the port of Marseilles on November 3rd, 1600. It's an oil on canvas. And I want you to look at this and think about the ideas of perspective, mass, shape, and space, and how you would actually be able to discuss those using the terminology of the chapter. The final slide here, these are the 2 YouTube videos I want you to watch and practice both of the activities. You'll need to turn them in our next class. However, I've also given you separate links to these on Blackboard. If you have any questions, please let me know.